Um, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our February webinar. This evening, we will be talking about PTSD and hair pulling, so post-traumatic stress disorder and hair pulling. This was the topic that you selected last time. The poll for our March webinar is open, so make sure to vote so that you get to hear what you're interested in. And if you have any topics to propose, you can just type them in the Q&A along with all of your questions, and I will put them on a list and then include them in the poll for next month. This is a very complex topic, so I've decided to make it simple and straightforward and kind of emphasize what PTSD is and how and why sometimes it leads to hair pulling and why they coexist with one another. So that will be the gist of the webinar. And then if any of the topics that I mention or talk about or any of the examples that I give you, if they seem interesting to you in some way, let me know, and then we can make a whole topic out of that, because this is really a rather complex subject matter. So these are some of the topics we'll discuss. Obviously, as always, we will be talking about what PTSD is and how to recognize it and what trauma actually is, so that we understand what is it that we're talking about. Then we'll talk about how PTSD shifts a person's worldview and what effects it has on the body, because as you will see, this is a particularly important aspect in terms of why sometimes people with PTSD struggle with hair pulling. And we'll talk about hyperarousal and what the connection is to hair pulling. Once we're finished with that part, we'll go to the Q&A. I see that some of you have already started asking questions. So as I go through the presentation, ask anything that you're interested in, and you don't have to limit yourself only to the topic of the webinar. So anything you want to know, you can ask. And then once I'm done, I will answer your questions. Let's get started. So first, the obvious question is, what is it that we're talking about? So what is PTSD? So post-traumatic stress disorder is essentially a psychological issue, but a very complex one. So there's no single symptom that makes up PTSD. So it has a diverse and a very varying set of symptoms that develop as a response to a traumatic event. So the intensity of the symptoms can vary, but also symptoms can be so different from person to person that unless you actually know that there's trauma behind it, you would never assume that it is the same issue. So that's how comprehensive the symptoms are, and that's how different they are. Most people who experience trauma will have some symptom in the period following the trauma. So when we experience something as intense as a trauma, we will have a reaction to it. However, not every reaction to trauma is PTSD. We can start talking about a person having PTSD once these symptoms persist for months or years, and more importantly, once they affect a person's day-to-day functioning. So it is absolutely normal to have an intense reaction to a traumatic event, but once it persists and when it actually prevents you from doing what you need to do in your everyday life, that's when it becomes a problem. In general, it's rather difficult to draw the line between normal behavior and pathological behavior in my field of work. And one of the definitions that I really like, and that sound kind of cheesy, but it's really true and useful, which is Freud's definition as being normal, meaning to be able to work and love. And in that sense, it's only when you're not able to do these things that we can talk about a problem. And the same goes for PTSD. So you can experience certain symptoms, or you can be changed by a traumatic event, but as long as you're able to have stable relationships, if that's your goal, and advance in your career and do what's expected of you, you don't have to think of yourself as having PTSD. Just being changed in response to extraordinary or really any kind of experience isn't necessarily PTSD. In fact, if you think about it, if we're not transformed by our experiences, then there's also something wrong with us because we're supposed to be changed by experiences. And the more intense and the stranger and the more difficult the experience is, the greater is the change that we experience. So when we talk about PTSD, it's important to actually address the T in PTSD, meaning what exactly is trauma. There's really no the definition that we can agree on and that APA often uses is not particularly informative. So they define trauma as an intense negative emotional response to an event. So for something to be a trauma, it's not enough for it to just be negative. It's not enough even for it to be intense, as the definition says, and it's not enough that it's distressing. There are many things that are distressing or negative or intense, but we don't consider them to be traumas. It has to be overwhelming to us. But again, not in the sense that in that moment we're just overcome by intense emotions. It has to actually exceed our capacity to process the event and cope with it. In a sense, it has to shatter a part of us for it to be a true trauma. So just pay attention to what I'm saying here. The event itself is not the trauma. It's the response to the event that constitutes trauma. And this may seem like I'm just playing with words here, but the difference is actually quite significant. Um, because there is a great deal of variability in terms of what will be traumatic and for whom. I see that a lot of you are raising your hands now, so please just type your questions or your opinions or your comments, and I will read them all and address them all once I'm done with the presentation. The reason why I'm emphasizing this is because sometimes as a therapist, I will hear horrible stories that when people tell me, I think, oh my God, this must have been so traumatic. But then the person tells me, oh, that, not really. Like it was intense, it was difficult, but it wasn't a trauma. Meaning that something that can be just an uncomfortable experience for me could be truly traumatic to some of you, and vice versa. What some of you might find to be just mildly distressing could possibly shatter my worldview. Sorry. So, in that sense, we cannot say that anything in particular would be traumatic to everyone. The thing is, what kind of coping mechanisms we have prior to the trauma and how they allow us to actually deal with the event that determines whether or not something will be traumatic to us. So, how do we know if someone has PTSD? If the symptoms are so diverse and the definition of trauma is so individual or so subjective, then, how do we recognize PTSD? Well, for one, by actually very carefully listening to what our clients are telling us. One of the things that I really appreciate, so if you've been to any of my previous webinars, then you know that my main way of thinking is constructivist, and that there is in particular one constructivist whose work I deeply respect, which is George Kelly. So, according to Kelly, one of the first things that we have to do as therapists, and I recommend this to anyone just as human beings, is to be credulous. So, when someone tells you that an event was terribly difficult for them to cope with, well, believe them. No one invents trauma. So, trusting what your client tells you would be the first step. And the reason why we have to rely on trusting our clients, so there's like 7 of you raising your hands at this point. So please just type the question that you have. So the reason why I'm saying that it's important to trust the client is precisely because there is no objective measurement of trauma. What could be what could be incredibly traumatic for me might not be for you. At the same time, I will frequently hear stories from clients that will be terribly difficult or impossible for them to cope with. And when I work with them and listen to their stories, I understand why that's the case. But if those events were to happen to me, some of them have, they really didn't leave much of a trace. It's because they mean different things to us, and we come into this world with, in different circumstances. We have different experiences. We come from different families, different cultures. All this together means that we're equipped with different coping mechanisms, and that we process different emotions in a different way, and that we understand events in a different way. So this is why the crucial thing is to listen to what your clients are telling you. If you have been traumatized by something and you feel like your therapist or your psychiatrist or whoever is taking care of your mental health are not taking you seriously, well, make sure to let them know. And make sure to fight for your voice to be heard. Because if someone's not listening to your story, they're just not being very good at their job. So now that I've done this little rant, let me give you some idea of what PTSD can look like. And then we will go through, sorry, my throat is a bit sore. So let's just go through a list of symptoms, and then I will point out those that I often see in conjunction with hair pulling, and those that I think are quite important because they could lead to hair pulling. So a first group of symptoms has to do with intrusive memories. And this is something that most people will think of when they think of PTSD. So people who struggle with PTSD will have recurrent distressing memories of the traumatic event. Those memories could be triggered by something that's happening outside, but they can also seemingly come at random. Of course, nothing in our psyche is random, but it can appear that way. Your thought process can lead you to one place, then to another place, then to another place, and then next thing you know, you associate that to the traumatic event, and then you relive it. So whether or not you recognize what your triggers are, recurring memories of the traumatic event are quite frequent. Then there are flashbacks where a person might actually just kind of be temporarily transported back to that moment, and then they relive the event. This is also a very common symptom. It is, however, possible to have flashbacks without having PTSD. So it is important to distinguish between the two. In general, when it comes to mental health, one symptom never constitutes the diagnosis. So we can have all kinds of symptoms but not have a specific disorder. And the same goes for memories, and the same goes for flashbacks, right? Then there are dreams or nightmares about the traumatic event. And then, of course, severe emotional distress or even physical reactions to something that reminds you even remotely to the traumatic event. So to give you an example, I once had a client who was he was in the army and he served 2 tours in Afghanistan, and he came to therapy, uh, and he defined his problem in a way that seemingly had nothing to do with his war experiences. But then as we started working together and as he kind of started understanding his own psychological life, he started making those connections. And for him, closing the door suddenly could make him jump out of his seat because the sound would trigger something from things that he had to live through. I also had one client who was severely physically abused in their childhood. And I remember I was working at the time, that was back when we had offline work, the good old times. And it was in my office, or rather what my office was back then. And they were doing some work in the building next door. And every time when someone would start drilling, my client would literally jump. And it came to the point where I had to ask a colleague of mine to use her office because it was on the other side of the building, so the noises weren't as loud. So these reactions could come to seemingly just benign sounds or smells or tastes, but in the person's mind, it transports them directly to the traumatic event. Now, this is the way that our brains normally work. Uh, if you want to see a non-traumatic illustration of this, read Freud or read Proust if you like fiction. Like his entire opus came from a taste of a cookie. So our mind in general works this way. We tend to associate events one with the other, with the other, with the other, because that's how we structure our experiences, right? Um, just to give you an example, before this webinar, I remembered that I forgot to submit a proposal for a paper that I want to present at a conference that will hopefully take place in July. And when I was there last time before COVID, I had a very intense experience presenting, and as soon as I remembered the conference, I immediately remembered how embarrassed I felt while I was presenting the paper. Because that's how our brains work. They just kind of create a chain of associations. This doesn't mean that I have PTSD from the conference, because indeed I don't. I just had a bad experience. But what I'm trying to tell you is that this kind of linkage of events is normal. So if you read this and you think, oh my God, when I do X, I think of this unpleasant experience, that doesn't mean that you have PTSD. It's just how your mind works, in my mind and everyone else's mind. With PTSD, this connection is incredibly intense and it works very fast. And of course, just this one specific thing isn't enough to actually diagnose someone with PTSD. There are other symptoms as well, and we will go through them now. There's a whole group of symptoms that will affect how people think and what their overall mood is. So one thing that develops, especially with those people who have PTSD because of neglect or abuse, you have negative view of self and others as well. So to give you a practical example, a couple of years ago in Trickstop, there was a client that was assigned to me to work with, and the way that our program works is that once you join and submit these initial questionnaires, the system just assigns you a therapist at random, basically. I mean, when I say at random, I mean therapists that work for us, but just the selection is random. And this client was assigned to me, and she grew up in a very abusive household, and she previously had a therapist offline who was male, and she really struggled to trust the therapist because her physical abuse came from her father, and then afterwards from a boyfriend, and then afterwards from another boyfriend. And then you can see how a male therapist can very easily link in there. And the first thing that she wrote to me before I even had a chance to review her worksheets was, I just see that I was assigned to you. Um, this is nothing personal, but can I please be reassigned to a female therapist? And then, of course, it's something that we could do, but it's not surprising that she would have, issues trusting men that she would consider authority figures. I mean, for the life of me, I don't know why anyone would consider me an authority figure, but in therapy, theoretically, I do understand that. So, based on the traumatic experience, a person can develop an approach to, let's say, a class of persons, to a certain occupation, to a certain age, or most frequently, gender, right? Negative view of self often comes from trauma, not only because of trauma itself, but also because of how your immediate surroundings may react to your trauma. So what happens very frequently is that, and I've seen this countless number of times with specifically women. I mean, this is speaking from my clinical experience. I'm sure there are men who've had this experience as well. But with women who were sexually abused in some way, and they come from very traditional or conservative backgrounds, for whatever reason, their families tend to turn against them. And then what they internalize is not only the trauma of abuse, but also the trauma of being held responsible for something that you perceive you had no agency over. And indeed you didn't, right? So that will also generate a horribly negative view of oneself, and then issues with self-worth and self-esteem. Hopelessness, I think, is pretty much an obvious one. Then there's also a sense of detachment from close people around you. I don't just mean emotional numbness, because I separated this as a different thing. A sense of detachment means that, at least in the context that I'm using it here, that the experience that a person has had is so radically different from what they see that others have had that you kind of lose any threads of commonality. You start thinking that what you're going through cannot possibly be comprehended by someone who didn't have not necessarily the same, but a similar experience. And I think there's a bit of a parallel here to hair pulling as well, where sometimes even mental health professionals, which could be a trauma in itself, will react to hair pulling with dismay, surprise, or dismissal. So a person is bound to develop a kind of detachment from their therapist because the therapist has just dismissed their struggle and their experience. So the more detached one feels from their immediate surroundings, the more lonely and hopeless a person feels. And then how do you can you guess how that reflects on someone's sense of self-worth or their view of other people, right? So these symptoms kind of feed one into the other, right? There's loss of interest or pleasure from what was once engaging and pleasurable, which is also something that we see in conditions like depression or adjustment disorders. So this is not exclusive to PTSD, but it often is a part of it. Then emotional numbness as a way to avoid difficult emotions that might arise. It's it's an avoidant mechanism, and we'll talk about this a little later, but it's also a protective mechanism at the same time. Because the emotions that come with trauma are not just I'm feeling anxious today. They're emotions that we feel might destroy us. That is the level of intensity that they have. So, emotional numbness, as unpleasant as it might seem and as it might be, is actually a defense mechanism. It's something that keeps the person functional, or at least as close to functional as possible. Then, depressed mood would be, again, an obvious one, anxiety, but also memory problems. We know from many studies that have been done over the years, both in general population and also with people who struggle with PTSD, that our memory is not very reliable. But when it comes to traumatic memories, this is even more pronounced. So sometimes people will forget their trauma. They will have all the symptoms of PTSD, and yet they will have no memory of what happened. I've had several clients over the years who developed this assumption, this idea that they may have experienced some sort of trauma, but for a long, long time, the memory was inaccessible to them. The reason why they assumed they experienced trauma is because they could recognize that symptoms come from being traumatized. They can compare how they react to what they read or how other people react, and then they can kind of logically deduce, but the memory is not there. At other times, um, memories can be masked and reinterpreted so that they seem less traumatic. And this can sometimes take really interesting and even bizarre forms. Um, I'll skip an example here because I have an example, but and I have a permission from the client. I wanted to write a paper about this specific client, but I don't have the permission to share it here, so I'm not going to. But let's just say that our minds can be quite creative in terms of how we remember, how we explain, and how we interpret those events to make them less traumatic. Avoidance symptoms of avoidance are quite common and very important for us and the work that we do here at Trickstop. When you're faced with something, so if we just go back to how I define trauma, basically trauma is something that blows up a part of you, right? It's something that is so big that you cannot give it any coherent meaning. It's like this alien event. It's like an internal 9/11 in a way, right? So when you face something that you cannot make sense of, it leads to a lot of anxiety and it leads to all these negative emotions and thought patterns that I already described. One part of replaying that event in your head is trying somehow to give it meaning. This would be similar, although not the same, as when we ruminate. You know those, like when you have a problem and then you just kind of go through the same problem over and over and over again in your head, or tell the same story 25 times to other people, hoping that you will find an angle that will allow you to solve the issue? Well, the same principle exists with the memory replay, um, with PTSD, right? So we try to make sense of the event. But because this constant replay of what happened generates more and more negative emotions, and there comes a point where if you cannot dissociate from it and you keep repeating it, it becomes just too much. The repetition becomes traumatic in itself. And then avoidance comes in as a kind of deus ex machina, so to speak, like just a magical solution almost. Once you develop mechanisms to avoid those thoughts and feelings that may bear any kind of association with the trauma, you actually find some relief. So, for example, people will come to therapy because of trauma and then they'll never talk about it, or they will mention it and then drift away somewhere else. That's one way of not facing the trauma, not experiencing the trauma. As therapists, we tend to understand this as resistance, but what it actually is also a way to protect oneself. When we think that an experience might kill us, might destroy us, of course we're going to avoid it, right? I mean, rationally, you might know that a memory is not going to kill you, but knowing something rationally and knowing something emotionally are two very, very different ways of knowing. So people who struggle with PTSD might start avoiding people that in some way remind them of those that are associated with the trauma. If you've been attacked in some way or abused or bullied or any of this, you might find the tendency to avoid people that even remotely remind you of those people that have bullied you, for example. You might avoid places that resemble those places where you've experienced your trauma. Same goes for events, right? Anything that might remind you of the trauma and then get you to relive it, you might be tempted to avoid. Substance abuse is very, very common with people who struggle with PTSD. So here I mean alcohol, drugs, even gambling, although I guess that's not technically substance abuse, but it is an addiction. Um, Often people will use avoidance strategies that are more socially acceptable, like playing video games, or burying yourself in your work. That can also be an avoidance strategy of avoidance. Um, Substance abuse, the reason why I put this under avoidant behaviors is because that's one way to numb your feelings and thoughts and not have to actually deal with them, right? It's a way to cope, but not process. Kind of like hair pulling, if you remember our webinar about emotional avoidance. Another group of symptoms that come with PTSD are physical and emotional reactions, which can also be very varied and diverse. You might be easily startled or frightened. You might always be on guard, looking for danger. You might engage in self-harm of some sorts. Self-harm tends to numb emotional pain by sort of replacing it with more acutely intense physical pain. You might develop attention problems or insomnia, including night terrors and things like that. Anger, irritability, impatience, poor impulse control, and then guilt or shame, depending on the type of trauma that you've experienced. Post-traumatic stress disorder is also reflected in our bodies. And this is actually the second, I would say, most important group of symptoms. Uh, if you summarize everything that I just mentioned in the past 20 minutes or so, and if you put it in the simplest possible terms, here's a way of saying it. PTSD is about keeping you vigilant and making sure that what once happened doesn't happen again. You can imagine that this will always keep you on guard. So a person that struggles with PTSD is always on the lookout for danger. There's no time to relax, right? So being in this constant state of vigilance and arousal is always reflected in the body because it's the body that gets aroused. Danger is quite literally everywhere, right? From the outside is an obvious one because that's where the traumatic event came from. But because of difficult thoughts and memories and intrusive flashbacks, that's also internal danger. So not only can you not relax because of your external circumstances, you also can't really relax because of your internal landscape. So there's no safety anywhere, right? Being so on guard and so vigilant all the time creates a lot of tension and a lot of anxiety because you always have to be ready to run or fight. That means that your body is working overtime, nonstop. There's actually a study that I read, I think maybe about a year ago, that says that people who have PTSD also report a lot more muscle pain, so physical pain. We're not talking about something, psychological, imagined, and things like that. We're talking about actual physical pain. They report muscle ache, the kind of muscle ache that you would get from exercising a lot. Because when we are tense and anxious, our muscles contract. That's where tension actually tends to accumulate. Even if you don't have PTSD, this is something that you can easily relate to. I think if you work a lot or you're stressed in some other way, pay attention to what happens to your shoulders or this triangle here between your eyebrows. When you start frowning, that's your muscles contracting. So that's where tension is stored. When I work with clients, PTSD or not, I sometimes ask them to pay attention to their fingers, their hands, their feet, their shoulders, because those are the places where you can easily identify tension because of the muscles that are contracted. With people who have PTSD, this can be just a normal, constant state of mind. I cannot tell you how many clients I've had where I would ask them if they feel any tension and they say no, but at the same time they're sitting like this with their shoulders up. And this is because their muscles are constantly contracted to the point where they don't actually consider it an issue. Like if your muscles are constantly tense, then you don't even really notice that they are tense because that's your baseline. PTSD is in general associated with a lot more somatization than what you would expect to see in an average person, and different kinds of pains of unknown origins. Now, I will list some conditions that we know from studies come more frequently in people who struggle with PTSD. So, fibromyalgia, for example, is quite common. Irritable bowel syndrome as well. Chronic fatigue, hypertension. There are a few studies done on war veterans and even like, for example, there's one study that shows that policemen in Brazil, I think, who've experienced traumatic events at work, which, if you're a police officer, you probably experience, they tend to have hypertension more frequently than other people, and then elevated heart rate. So everyone's heart rate will be elevated at certain times of day or when we deal with certain kinds of events, but someone who's had PTSD might have elevated baseline heart rate. So your heart is beating faster by default as a consequence of trauma. Then sweating, obviously, that's an easy one to assume. But then I've read studies from Serbia and Croatia, considering the history of the region. There's a lot of PTSD there. And there are studies that show that people who've been through the Balkan wars of the 90s tend to have more elevated cholesterol and triglyceride levels, which then leads to increased risks of coronary artery disease. And, so in that sense, it's like a double risk that you get. Obesity is also very common among people who have PTSD. And I put that here because it's something that is just obviously physically related to the body. But you can also count that as partially only as being an avoidance strategy. The way pulling can be seen as being avoidant, eating can also be seen as avoidant. I don't know if there's over 100 of you on this call, and I'm pretty sure that most of you, if not all of you, have eaten at some point in your lives when you're very sad or very anxious. So sometimes we tend to mask our feelings by overeating, which obviously, if done long enough, can lead to obesity. But there's also a different way of explaining this, which is that your cortisol levels are elevated when you experience trauma, especially if it's chronic trauma. And then cortisol levels alter your glucose metabolism and your metabolism overall. So that can also lead to kind of creating more fat. And then gastric issues as a stress response are also very common with people who struggle with PTSD. So why did I go into so many details about this? This part and the part about avoidance are for me two key components to understanding why and how PTSD and hair pulling coexist, and why hair pulling often kind of can come at the foundation of PTSD. Before I go into details here, I just want to make one distinction clear. There are lots of people who have PTSD, but they don't pull their hair. And there are a lot of people who pull their hair, but they don't have PTSD. So one doesn't necessarily imply the other. This is quite important because uh, I don't know why, but among my colleagues, I mean, therapists, psychiatrists, social workers, all of us who deal in some way with mental health, there seems to be this idea that hair pulling necessarily stems from trauma of some sorts. And this really isn't accurate. It's a fair assumption to have, but when you're working with a person, you really have to follow their story. So it's not something that we should take as a dogma of any kind, right? But when hair pulling comes from PTSD, these are the two components that tend to be particularly important: avoidant behaviors and hyperarousal. You can consider hyperarousal as something that's actually triggering in itself. When you think about what triggers hair pulling, it's usually negative emotions. Maybe not all negative emotions for all of you, but as a general rule, that is something that I feel kind of safe saying. Every emotion that you feel will somehow have a reflection in your body. Think about being anxious. You might feel something in your abdomen, or your breathing might become shallow, or your heart rate will accelerate, or you might feel, I don't know, all kinds of sensations running through your body. You might feel a lump in your throat. When your body is constantly aroused, that means not only that it's full of sensations at all times, or most of the time, but it also means that whatever you feel will be more intense because your body is not calm to begin with. So if, let's say, a person without PTSD, their baseline's here, a person with PTSD, their baseline is here. So when you think about any emotion happening, if it elevates where you are, you can kind of see how a person with PTSD will have, by default, a more intense reaction. So hyperarousal can itself be triggering because it's difficult to be with, but at the same time, it's more likely to make any other emotion triggering for you, even if maybe before PTSD it wasn't, or without PTSD it wouldn't be. So it both creates an environment where you're easily triggered to pull, and in itself it triggers pulling. Why does it trigger pulling, you might ask? It's because one of the things about hair pulling and skin picking and nail biting, all BFRBs, is that they serve as a way to distract ourselves from those sensations that we cannot be with. I guess put in mindfulness terms, you can say that it's a lack of equanimity that we're talking about. So it's very difficult for many people who struggle with hair pulling to be with distressing sensations. When you ask why, you usually get an answer because yes, it's just difficult. It's a skill that they don't possess. So here with PTSD, you immediately have a situation where this skill is absolutely necessary. In absence of that skill, any kind of avoidant behavior might be useful and good. Because PTSD in itself already includes certain symptoms or indications of avoidance, such as substance abuse or avoiding people or situations, um, pulling is just one more tool in that box that you already have. So it's something that can easily be incorporated because internally it already makes sense. There's already a box that you can put it into. So hyperarousal will lead to avoidance, and pulling can be one way in which you avoid negative emotions. So I hope that connection and that transition makes sense for you. I'll share two examples here from my clients from TrickStop. I didn't use any intimate details, and both of these clients have given me their permissions to share these specific paragraphs of text. Here's one from another person who served abroad. I sit with all this mess inside of me. My breath is shallow and I know nothing will happen, but I can't help but think I'll suffocate. If I pull right now, I won't think about that. And this is pretty much as straightforward an admission of avoidance as you can get. Pulling your hair because of the sensation that it causes, be it a painful or a pleasurable one, or both at the same time, it will deter your attention from the memories or the body sensations. If I pull right now, I won't think about that. I can't sit still. So too much stuff is going on inside the body. I feel like my skin is too tightly wound around my body. It will explode. My insides will splatter all over the wall. I saw that once, I think about it so much. So here's also a connection of how your own experience of your body can actually trigger a traumatic memory. The faces, the smells. So these are some things that trigger my client and some things that come back to him. Just writing this makes me want to pull because it brings him in contact with the experience. You wouldn't believe what's going through my head. I don't want to swear. I don't know how YouTube will react to that. I just close my eyes and it all comes back. Someone slammed the car door in front of Target the other day, and I instinctively wanted to jump under my own car. Again, you can see how something that other people might not even notice stands out as a trigger and triggers such very radical behavior. And you can see how pulling here, I don't want to seem inappropriate, but it's almost like a gift. Because no matter how damaging pulling is and how difficult it is to cope with, reduce, heal from, it's still easier than having these memories and being triggered to that extent. When people get stuck in treatment, I sometimes ask them if there are any reasons that they can think of why they wouldn't want to give up pulling. And that's usually when they tell me that it's a preposterous question to ask. But if you listen to what I read and if you read it now on the screen, I hope you can see how pulling, even though it is a problem in itself, actually solves another problem. It helps a person deal with something that was much worse. In constructivist in constructivist psychology, there is this idea that what is a problem like hair pulling, is actually not just a problem, but it's also a solution. So a solution for something else. In this case, in a very strange way, hair pulling is almost like a solution for certain aspects of PTSD. It's a solution that comes at a very high cost, so it's also a problem at the same time. It's kind of like people try to treat chronic pain and then they end up with opioid addiction. So they may have solved the pain issue temporarily, but what they ended up with was an addiction issue, which is not easier to deal with. So solution becomes the problem, and then unless you find a healthy and intentionally select a solution, another solution might become a problem in itself. It's like a chain that feeds itself all the time. Here's another one. This is a person, a client of mine, a woman that was raped on a date. He said I had pretty blonde hair, and now I pull my pretty blonde hair. I know it sounds absurd, but it's like I'm safer if I don't have it. Again, here you can see how pulling is strangely protective. If I look like a freak, maybe no one will look at me, no one will touch me. Again, I know it's absurd, but I feel like pulling my hair protects me. I feel safe knowing I look horrible. But then at the same time, this person is in the program, in Trickstop, and wanting to work on pulling. And one of the things that we have to work with is how to feel safe. Because if we don't resolve this issue, then no matter what we do with pulling in terms of practical techniques and all these things that we can do to help my client pull less, none of this will have a long-term effect so long as she doesn't feel safe around men. And with the experience that she had, it's really difficult, to not understand why she would struggle with this. So hair pulling is a problem, but at the same time, it's also a solution because, paradoxically, it makes her feel safer because she's less likely to be targeted. This is a person that wrote about her trauma in the first entry when she started the program. So in the intake questionnaires that you fill out in the beginning, because she was quite conscious. She had this experience, and then a month later she started pulling. So it wasn't a stretch for her to recognize the connection. And I immediately said that I can have her transferred to another therapist. And she said, no, no, I know you from your webinars. You're not very threatening. And also, I need to be able to trust a man if I'm going to heal from this. So for her, working through our relationship is a way of healing. And then she will often share with me what makes her feel vulnerable, what she hesitates to share, and then we'll talk about this. We discuss, for example, how she would like me to approach it so that she feels safe, so that she can have a guarantee that I will approach the issue respectfully. And then as we work together and as she slowly works on trusting me, we're also working on making her feel safer around others as well. And then partially kind of working through trauma. This may sound like a simple thing when I put it this way, but it takes a long time. Feeling safe is a very fundamental need. Actually, perhaps one of the most fundamental things about us as humans. So when I say, oh, we're just working through, and doing this work together, it's actually quite complicated. It has its, backs and forths and progress and then relapses and episodes of trust and then episodes of distrust. And so it goes back and forth. The way that we change is always messy. But whenever it comes to issues like safety, you can immediately know that there's a lot of work to be done ahead. Something else that we work on with this client and the previous one, so to kind of differentiate them, with the previous client, that client has no issues trusting me as a therapist because my client's trauma is not related to anything intimate in that sense. This client's trauma, yes. So with the previous client, we don't have to continuously analyze our relationship. Sometimes we do for other reasons, but not because of safety. But with this client, that's pretty much the central aspect of our work. But in addition to this, We're also looking and trying to find different ways to make her feel at home in her own body, to make her feel like she can make herself feel safe. Because sadly, world is not always open to dialogue. So it is very important that she has ways of making herself feel safe. So that's also something that we're working with. And for this client specifically, she doesn't really like the practical techniques to stop pulling because she recognizes what her central issue is, and then this is what she chooses to prioritize. For other people, working on trauma directly might be too much. And then starting with these very down to earth practical techniques like wear gloves, use a worry stone, here's a breathing exercise, these things could actually be a much better way to start. So if this is something that you struggle with and you have a therapist and you feel like you're not progressing enough or you don't trust them, the first thing is obviously to share this. And if they don't have the patience and the compassion and the skill to listen, they're really not the right choice for you. And this profession might not be the right choice for them, if I'm being mean. But you have to be listened to. So speak up and tell your therapist what you need. That in itself is a huge step. And then find the right approach for you. In general, I really don't like these overly generalized approaches to treatment. I think, especially when it comes to something so personal and something so intimate and individual like trauma, therapy work has to be fully customized. So there's no protocol that someone has to follow. They just have to be very much attuned to how you feel and how much you can take, and then go one step at a time.